Imagine that one of the strangest spy operations in history doesn't begin with a secret agent, a high-tech satellite, or even a hidden camera. Instead, it begins with an ordinary street cat sitting calmly on a bench next to a few people. No one around suspects that this animal could be part of a secret intelligence mission worth millions of dollars. It sounds like the plot of a spy movie or a science fiction story. But during the Cold War, ideas like this were actually discussed inside the offices of intelligence agencies. Sometimes the most serious organizations in the world made decisions that today seem almost unbelievable. The 1960s were one of the most tense periods in modern history. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in constant rivalry. Each side possessed enormous numbers of nuclear weapons capable of destroying entire countries within hours. One mistake, one false signal, or one misunderstood piece of information could lead to a global catastrophe. Because of this, information became one of the most valuable resources in the world. Intelligence could prevent a war or accidentally trigger a major crisis. Political decisions, military plans, new technologies, everything became a target for spies. Thousands of people were involved in this invisible war. Agents operated undercover in different countries, passing secret documents, photographing military facilities, and recruiting informants. Sometimes a single leak of information could change the course of the Cold War. But human spies were vulnerable. They could be exposed, arrested, or even eliminated. For that reason, intelligence agencies began searching for new ways to gather information. They turned to the most advanced technologies available at the time. During the 1960s, electronics were rapidly becoming smaller and more sophisticated. Engineers were developing tiny microphones, transmitters, and recording devices. It became possible to hide listening devices in everyday objects. Bugs were placed inside telephones, lamps, walls, and pieces of furniture. Sometimes they were even hidden inside gifts or souvenirs given to diplomats. But all of these methods had one major problem. The device first had to be installed near the target. That meant an agent had to secretly enter the location. These missions often involved enormous risk. If a spy was caught, it could lead not only to an international scandal, but also to a serious diplomatic crisis. That's why specialists at the CIA began thinking about a safer way to conduct surveillance. They needed something that could approach people on its own without raising suspicion. Something that could move freely in public spaces and remain unnoticed. That's when an idea appeared that even some intelligence officers initially thought was crazy. What if the spy wasn't a human at all, but an ordinary animal? Animals are constantly around people. They walk through streets, enter courtyards and parks, sit on benches, or wander near buildings. No one pays much attention to them. Because of that, they could become the perfect tool for covert surveillance. At first, several possibilities were discussed. Some experts suggested using pigeons that could carry tiny devices. Others considered training dogs for observation missions. But gradually, researchers began focusing on cats. These animals had several important advantages. Cats move quietly, often approach people on their own, and can sit nearby without attracting attention. They are also independent creatures. Cats are used to wandering around by themselves, and no one would be surprised if one suddenly appeared near diplomats or government officials. For a spy operation, that was almost the perfect cover. It was at this moment that an idea was born inside one of the CIA's departments. An idea that would later become known as one of the strangest intelligence projects ever attempted. Engineers proposed turning an ordinary cat into a living listening device. The plan was incredibly ambitious. If a microphone and radio transmitter could be implanted inside the animal, the cat could approach specific people and transmit their conversations from a distance. Operators nearby would receive the audio in real time. This is how the development of a secret program began. A program that would eventually receive the code name Project Acoustic Kitty. At that time, no one yet realized that this experiment would become one of the most unusual stories of the Cold War. At first, the idea sounded almost absurd, even inside the CIA. Turning a cat into a surveillance device seemed more like a joke than a serious intelligence project. But the Cold War was an era when intelligence agencies were willing to experiment with almost anything if there was even the smallest chance it could give them an advantage over their enemy. And in the early 1960s, American intelligence was desperate to find new ways to secretly monitor Soviet officials. Traditional surveillance methods had limits. Hidden microphones had to be planted inside buildings. Human agents had to risk their lives to install them. And even if the operation succeeded, the device could be discovered during a routine inspection. Soviet embassies and diplomatic buildings were heavily guarded and constantly checked for bugs. Intelligence officers knew that planting listening devices inside those buildings was becoming harder and more dangerous every year. The CIA wanted something different, something that could approach targets naturally, without raising suspicion. An animal seemed perfect for that role. Unlike people, animals were invisible to security. No guard would stop a cat walking through a park or sitting near a bench. No diplomat would suspect that a quiet animal nearby could actually be transmitting every word of their conversation. Once the concept was approved, the project moved from theory to engineering. Scientists and technicians began working on one of the most unusual technological challenges of the Cold War. Their goal was to create a fully functional listening system that could be hidden inside the body of a living animal. The equipment had to be extremely small, lightweight, and powerful enough to transmit audio over a distance. The plan required several components. First, a tiny microphone that could pick up human voices clearly. Second, a miniature radio transmitter that could send the signal to a nearby receiver. And third, an antenna that could be hidden without affecting the animal's movement. Everything had to be carefully designed so the cat could still behave normally. According to later reports, surgeons were involved in the project. During a complicated medical procedure, the microphone was implanted inside the cat's ear canal. The transmitter was placed inside the body, and the antenna was hidden along the tail. The goal was to make the technology completely invisible from the outside. But installing the electronics was only part of the problem. Engineers quickly realized that controlling the cat's behavior might be even harder than building the technology itself. Cats are famously independent animals. They don't follow commands the same way dogs do. They move wherever they want, whenever they want. Because of this, the CIA spent a long time trying to train the animal. Trainers attempted to teach the cat to walk toward specific locations and stay close to people sitting on benches or in parks. The idea was simple. If Soviet diplomats were having a conversation outside, the cat could approach them and quietly sit nearby while the device transmitted their voices. Training took months. Handlers tried to condition the cat using food rewards and repeated exercises. They hoped the animal would learn to move toward human voices and remain in a specific area long enough to capture useful information. But progress was slow. Cats rarely cooperate the way trainers expect. Despite the difficulties, the CIA continued investing time and money into the project. By some estimates, the program eventually cost around $10 million. Adjusted for inflation today, that would equal many tens of millions. For the agency, however, the potential payoff seemed worth it. If the system worked, it could open an entirely new method of intelligence gathering. After years of development, testing, and training, the moment finally came to try the system in the real world. The CIA decided it was time to see whether their unusual idea could actually work outside the laboratory. The first mission of the spy cat was about to begin, and no one involved could have predicted how quickly the entire project would collapse. By the mid-1960s, after years of research, surgeries, engineering work, and countless training sessions, the CIA believed the project was finally ready for a real test. The strange experiment that had once sounded like a joke had now consumed years of work and millions of dollars. Engineers had built the tiny electronics. Trainers had spent months trying to guide the cat's behavior. Now the agency wanted to see if their unusual creation could actually function during a real intelligence mission. The first operation was planned carefully. It would not take place in a secret laboratory or inside a controlled environment. Instead, it would happen in the real world, in a location where Soviet officials were known to spend time. The chosen area was near the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., one of the most sensitive diplomatic locations in the United States during the Cold War. The plan was relatively simple. Intelligence officers would release the cat nearby and allow it to move toward a location where two men were sitting and talking. These men were believed to be connected to the Soviet diplomatic mission. If the cat approached them and remained nearby, the hidden microphone would capture their conversation and transmit it to a receiver operated by CIA agents positioned at a distance. For the agency, this was a crucial moment. Years of effort were about to be tested in a matter of minutes. If the system worked, it could prove that animals could be used as covert surveillance tools. It might even open the door to entirely new types of intelligence operations. On the day of the test, CIA officers took their positions. Surveillance equipment was prepared. Receivers were turned on and calibrated to capture the signal from the tiny transmitter hidden inside the animal. The cat, carrying the miniature electronics, was released near the target area. At first, everything seemed to be going according to plan. The animal began moving across the street in the direction of the bench where the two men were talking. CIA operators watched closely, listening to the signal coming through their equipment. But within seconds, the situation took a sudden and disastrous turn. As the cat crossed the street, it wandered directly into traffic. A passing taxi struck the animal almost instantly. The entire operation ended in a moment. The first real mission of the CIA's spy cat had lasted only a few seconds. Years of work, millions of dollars, and one of the strangest technological experiments of the Cold War had come to an abrupt and completely unexpected end. The animal was gone, the equipment destroyed, and the operation was over before it had even begun. For the intelligence officers observing the mission, the failure must have been both shocking and frustrating. After all the planning, engineering, and training, the biggest problem had turned out to be something no one could truly control: the unpredictable behavior of a cat. The incident quickly revealed a deeper flaw in the entire concept. Even if the technology worked perfectly, animals could not be controlled with enough precision for intelligence operations. A cat might walk toward a target, or it might chase a sound, wander away, or run into the street. In the unpredictable environment of a city, there were simply too many variables. Not long after the failed test, the CIA quietly canceled the project. The agency concluded that the idea, while technically impressive, was simply impractical for real-world intelligence work. Project Acoustic Kitty became another strange footnote in the long history of Cold War experimentation, an example of how far intelligence agencies were willing to go in their search for new ways to spy on their enemies. But the story of the spy cat was far from over, because decades later, when secret documents were finally declassified, the world would discover just how unusual some Cold War experiments had really been. For many years after the failure of the mission, almost no one outside the CIA knew that Project Acoustic Kitty had ever existed. The operation was classified, and the details of the strange experiment remained locked away inside secret government archives. Like many Cold War projects, it simply disappeared into silence. Inside the intelligence community, however, the project became a quiet lesson about the limits of technology and control. Engineers had managed to solve extremely difficult technical problems. They had created miniature electronics small enough to fit inside a living animal. They had developed transmitters capable of sending audio signals from a moving target. From a purely technological perspective, the project had actually been impressive. The real problem was something far less predictable than engineering: biology and behavior. Unlike machines, animals cannot be programmed. They have instincts, fears, distractions, and their own unpredictable reactions to the world around them. Even the best training could not guarantee that a cat would move exactly where intelligence officers wanted it to go. For intelligence planners, that unpredictability made the entire concept unreliable. A spy operation requires control and precision. Agents need to know exactly where the listening device will be and how long it will stay there. With a cat wandering freely through a city street, that level of control was impossible. Eventually, the CIA officially ended the program. The agency quietly closed the files and moved on to other technologies that seemed more promising. During the following decades, surveillance methods changed dramatically. Satellites began photographing military installations from space. Advanced microphones became easier to hide in buildings. Later, digital technology would make surveillance even more powerful. Compared to those developments, the idea of a spy cat began to seem almost surreal. Yet during the Cold War, when intelligence agencies were competing in a global race for information, even the most unusual ideas could receive serious funding and attention. For decades, the story remained unknown to the public. It was only many years later, when classified documents began to be released, that historians and journalists discovered the details of the project. Government archives revealed reports describing the strange experiment, the surgical procedures, the training process, and the failed mission in Washington. When the documents became public, the story quickly attracted attention around the world. Many people were surprised that such an unusual project had actually existed. Others saw it as a perfect example of how extreme the Cold War competition between superpowers had become. But historians also pointed out something important. Project Acoustic Kitty was not just a bizarre curiosity. It reflected a real mindset inside intelligence agencies during that era. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were constantly searching for any possible advantage over their rival. If an idea had even a small chance of working, it might be tested. In that environment, imagination often moved faster than practicality. Engineers and scientists pushed the boundaries of what technology could do. Some projects led to major breakthroughs. Others ended as strange and forgotten experiments. Project Acoustic Kitty ultimately belonged to the second category. It never produced useful intelligence and never became an operational tool. But it did reveal just how creative, and sometimes how desperate, Cold War intelligence efforts could become. Today, the story of the CIA's Spy Cat remains one of the most unusual episodes in the history of espionage. It reminds us that behind the serious political conflicts of the Cold War, there were also moments of strange experimentation, unexpected ideas, and plans that sounded more like fiction than reality. When people first heard the story of the CIA's Spy Cat, many assumed it had to be exaggerated or misunderstood. The idea of turning a household pet into a surveillance device sounded more like a piece of satire than a real intelligence program. But the documents released years later confirmed that the project had been entirely real, and that it was only one example of how far intelligence agencies were willing to go during the Cold War. The competition between the United States and the Soviet Union was not limited to nuclear weapons or space exploration. Behind the scenes, a silent technological race was taking place inside laboratories, research centers, and intelligence facilities. Scientists, engineers, and analysts were constantly searching for new tools that could gather information without being detected. Many of these experiments focused on surveillance. Governments wanted to hear private conversations, intercept communications, and observe meetings without the targets ever realizing they were being watched. The more discreet the technology was, the more valuable it became. That is why intelligence agencies invested heavily in miniaturization. During the 1950s and 1960s, electronics were shrinking rapidly. Transistors replaced large vacuum tubes, and new manufacturing techniques allowed devices to become smaller and lighter. What once required an entire room of equipment could now be built into something that fit inside a small object. This technological shift opened the door to entirely new ideas. Microphones could be hidden inside everyday items, pens, briefcases, watches, even coins. Small transmitters could secretly send audio signals to nearby receivers. These innovations made surveillance far more flexible than it had been just a decade earlier. But intelligence officers quickly realized that the most difficult part of surveillance was often not the technology itself. It was getting the device close enough to the target. Installing a listening device required access, and access was always risky. Embassies, government buildings, and diplomatic residences were some of the most secure locations in the world. Security teams regularly searched rooms for hidden microphones. Walls were inspected, furniture examined, and electronic signals monitored. Any suspicious device could be discovered and removed. Because of this, intelligence agencies began looking for creative ways to bypass security entirely. Instead of secretly entering buildings, they started asking a different question. What if the listening device could approach the target naturally, without any intrusion at all? That line of thinking produced some of the most unusual concepts of the Cold War. Engineers explored ways to hide surveillance tools in unexpected places, inside clothing, vehicles, and everyday personal objects. Some projects even examined the possibility of using insects or birds as carriers for tiny devices. In that context, the Spy Cat project no longer seemed quite as absurd as it might today. It was simply one more attempt to solve a difficult problem using whatever technology was available at the time. The idea behind Acoustic Kitty was actually simple. Create a mobile listening device that could quietly move near people having a conversation. If successful, the system could capture discussions taking place outdoors, conversations that would otherwise be impossible to record. Parks, sidewalks, and public benches were common places for informal meetings. Diplomats and officials often spoke freely in these locations, assuming they were safe from surveillance. Traditional listening devices could not easily reach those spaces, but a wandering animal sitting nearby would attract no attention at all. From the perspective of Cold War intelligence planners, that possibility was extremely tempting. If the technology could work, it might allow agents to overhear conversations that had previously been completely inaccessible. In theory, the concept had a certain logic. In practice, however, it collided with one simple reality. Animals do not behave like machines. The failure of the first mission had demonstrated that problem in the most dramatic way possible. No matter how advanced the electronics were, the success of the entire operation still depended on the unpredictable movements of a cat. And that was a variable no engineer could truly control. In the years that followed, more details about the strange project slowly began to surface through declassified government records. One of the most important moments came decades later, when documents connected to Cold War intelligence programs were released under the Freedom of Information Act. In 2001, several reports from the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology confirmed that Project Acoustic Kitty had been a real operation conducted during the early 1960s. According to those documents, the program was launched around 1961, at a time when the Cold War was entering one of its most dangerous phases. Just a year later, in 1962, the world would experience the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the United States and the Soviet Union came closer to nuclear war than ever before. Intelligence gathering during that period was considered absolutely critical. Every conversation, every diplomatic signal, and every piece of information could influence decisions made in Washington or Moscow. Inside the CIA, the project was reportedly managed by specialists working in the agency's technical research divisions. One of the key figures connected with advanced surveillance technology during that era was Dr. Robert W. Frosch, a scientist involved in various research efforts related to intelligence equipment. Although Acoustic Kitty was handled by several teams, it was part of a broader push inside the CIA to experiment with unconventional surveillance tools. The surgical work required for the project was unusually complex. According to later reports, veterinarians and surgeons worked together to implant the listening equipment inside the animal. A tiny microphone was placed in the ear canal so it could capture human voices clearly. A small radio transmitter was implanted in the body, while a thin wire antenna was carefully routed along the tail. The entire system had to be extremely lightweight, so it would not affect the animal's natural movements. Engineers also had to design batteries small enough to fit inside the body, while still providing enough power to transmit a signal. In the early 1960s, miniaturized electronics were still in their early stages, which made the challenge even more difficult. Training the cat turned out to be one of the most frustrating parts of the project. According to some accounts, the CIA spent months attempting to teach the animal to move towards specific locations and remain near groups of people. Handlers tried using food as motivation, hoping the cat would associate certain sounds or commands with rewards. But the behavior of cats proved extremely difficult to control. Unlike dogs, which have been trained for centuries to follow commands, cats are far more independent. They often ignore instructions entirely, especially in unfamiliar environments. For intelligence officers hoping to conduct a precise surveillance operation, this independence created serious problems. Despite these challenges, the project continued for several years. By the time the first real-world test was planned in Washington, D.C., the CIA had already invested an estimated $10 million into the program. Adjusted for inflation, that amount would equal more than $80 million today. The test itself reportedly took place near the Soviet Embassy on 16th Street Northwest, one of the most closely monitored diplomatic areas in the United States at the time. During the Cold War, the embassy was under constant observation by American intelligence, while Soviet security services were equally cautious about potential surveillance. The idea behind the mission was straightforward. If the cat approached two men believed to be Soviet officials and sat nearby, the hidden microphone could transmit their conversation back to CIA operatives positioned across the street with a receiver. But as the now famous story goes, the mission ended almost immediately when the animal ran into the street and was struck by a taxi. While some historians debate whether that exact detail was dramatized over time, the official CIA report makes one conclusion very clear. The project failed during its first operational test. Shortly afterward, the agency officially canceled Project Acoustic Kitty. A later CIA memo reportedly concluded that while the technology itself was impressive, the use of animals for surveillance was simply too unreliable for practical intelligence operations. Yet even though the program ended in failure, it remains one of the most fascinating examples of Cold War experimentation. It showed how intelligence agencies were willing to explore ideas that ranged from brilliant to bizarre, all in the hope of gaining even the smallest advantage over their rival. And in the strange world of Cold War espionage, Project Acoustic Kitty was far from the only experiment that pushed the boundaries of imagination. In the end, Project Acoustic Kitty became one of the most unusual chapters in the long history of Cold War espionage. What began as an ambitious attempt to combine biology and technology ended as a reminder that even the most advanced engineering cannot easily control nature. Despite years of work, complex surgery, and millions of dollars in funding, the entire concept collapsed the moment it faced the unpredictable reality of the outside world. Yet the story is important for another reason. It perfectly captures the mindset of the Cold War era. During the 1950s and 1960s, the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union created enormous pressure on intelligence agencies. Both sides feared that the other might gain a technological advantage that could shift the balance of power. In that atmosphere, almost any idea, no matter how strange, could be explored, if there was even a small chance it might work. The CIA was not alone in experimenting with unusual methods. During the same period, intelligence agencies on both sides tested a wide range of unconventional technologies. Some projects involved early spy satellites capable of photographing military bases from space. Others focused on miniature cameras, hidden microphones, and advanced radio interception systems. A few experiments were even stranger than the spy cat, including attempts to use trained animals, insects, and experimental devices designed to gather information in completely new ways. Most of these projects never became operational tools. Some failed during testing, while others were simply too expensive or too unreliable. But a few of them eventually led to major technological breakthroughs. The rapid development of surveillance technology during the Cold War would later contribute to the creation of modern satellite imaging, digital communication interception, and advanced intelligence systems used today. When the documents about Acoustic Kitty were finally declassified decades later, historians and journalists saw the project not only as an odd curiosity, but also as a symbol of the extreme creativity and sometimes desperation of Cold War intelligence agencies. The program showed how far organizations were willing to go in their search for information. Today, the story often sounds almost humorous. The idea of a spy cat secretly recording conversations seems more like something from a comedy or a spy parody than a real government program. But behind the strange concept was a serious effort by engineers, scientists, and intelligence officers trying to solve one of the hardest problems in espionage: how to listen without being noticed. In the end, Project Acoustic Kitty did not change the course of the Cold War. It did not produce secret recordings or reveal hidden Soviet plans, but it left behind a fascinating story that continues to capture people's imagination decades later. Because sometimes the history of intelligence is not only about powerful weapons, dangerous missions, and world-changing secrets. Sometimes it is also about the moment when one of the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world tried to turn a simple cat into a spy.